The year was 1944. Summer burned across the Texas plains, a heat that shimmered over miles of wheat and sorghum. Trains cut through the stillness, their steel wheels shrieking as they slowed before long fences of new barbed wire. Out stepped men who had once marched under the swastika, now stripped of rifles, medals, and command. Their uniforms were faded, their boots cracked from sand and saltwater crossings. They blinked into the harsh American sun as if waking from another planet. To the locals who gathered at a distance, farmers in sweat-stained hats, boys perched on fence rails, stoic cowboys astride horses, the scene felt like something out of a surreal western. The enemy, the fabled Germans of newsreels and propaganda posters, were here, in their dust-blown backyard. No one in Hereford, Texas, or Roswell, New Mexico, had expected the war to come this far inland. Battles were supposed to stay overseas. Danger belonged to headlines, not to the quiet clop of a rancher's boots. But the United States Army had a logistical puzzle. Hundreds of thousands of Axis prisoners captured in North Africa, too many for Europe to hold. America's heartland, with its endless open space and reliable railroads, offered an answer. So the desert and prairie became prison country. In less than a year, dozens of camps rose like strange mirages. Barracks painted dull brown, guard towers of pine, coils of wire biting into the soil. Among the first to notice were the Cowboys, men who'd grown up watching nothing but sky and cattle herds. Some took jobs as civilian guards or labor overseers, swapping lassos for rifles. One of them, Jack Hollis, a lanky ranch hand with a sun-cracked grin, watched his new charges with curiosity more than hatred. "Never thought I'd be babysitting Hitler's boys," he muttered, but when he said it, there was no venom, only wonder. Many in town felt the same, wary, but intrigued. The war had felt abstract, now it wore tired faces. For the prisoners, the journey to America was bewildering. Most were young, conscripts from Hamburg or Bavaria, veterans of Tunisia who had seen their Africa corps crumble under Allied tanks. Some had been told they'd be executed, others expected squalid cages. Instead, they found a land so wide and strange it felt like fiction. The air was dry, the nights alive with coyotes, the mornings cut by the whistle of distant trains. Guards gave them coffee, clean water, sometimes even cigarettes. It was not home, but it was not hell. Days settled into an odd rhythm. Reveille sounded before dawn. German voices rolled across the yard as men stood for count, boots scraping the hardpan earth. They ate eggs, beans, bread, more than many had seen in months of war. Work details carried them into cotton fields and beet farms, guarded but rarely threatened. Farmers learned quickly that the prisoners were strong and precise. Some swore the Germans harvested faster than any local hand. Jack Hollis rode along the field edges, rifle across his lap, trying to look authoritative while secretly impressed. He saw them joke in their guttural tongue, sing under the relentless sun. More than once, he caught himself thinking, "They're just boys, like me." Yet beneath the surface, tension hummed. Nazi officers within the camps clung to military discipline, holding clandestine meetings, enforcing salute protocols. Those who seemed too friendly with Americans sometimes found threats slipped under their pillows. Escapes were rare but real. A few men slipped into the desert night, only to be caught days later, starving and sunburned. Newspapers ran headlines like, "Hun captured near Amarillo," feeding local suspicion. But the war was changing. Rumors drifted in, allies advancing in France, the Eastern Front collapsing. For younger prisoners, loyalty wavered under the weight of defeat and unexpected kindness. Life for townsfolk shifted, too. The camps became strange neighbors. Children dared each other to sneak close enough to see the enemy. Shopkeepers noticed soldiers buying flour and nails to keep the compounds running. A few preachers warned their congregations not to pity those who had marched under Hitler's flag. Others reminded them that mercy was also American. Women hung laundry and glanced toward the distant guard towers. Curiosity was hard to kill. One autumn afternoon, Jack rode fence line with another guard, an older rancher named Earl Simmons. They paused to watch prisoners picking cotton, a sea of tan shirts bending and straightening in the hot wind. "Doesn't feel right," Earl said, spitting tobacco. "They were shooting at our boys last year." Jack squinted against the sun. "Yeah, but they're here now. Just workin'. War's funny." Earl grunted, but didn't argue. The fence rattled in the breeze, a barrier and yet not, just a few strands of wire keeping worlds apart. Inside the barracks, nights were filled with music. Some prisoners had smuggled harmonicas or built guitars from scrap. They sang folk songs of the Rhine and the Alps. Others learned to hum American swing picked up from guard radios. Letters came, censored and delayed. Some men laughed over news from home. Others wept quietly into thin pillows. One young corporal, barely 20, carved a chess set from mesquite wood and played under lantern light, dreaming of a Europe that might not exist anymore. By early 1945, the landscape of war was tilting. Prisoners whispered of Hitler's health, of cities bombed into rubble. Guards knew it too. Jack listened to the radio each night, static crackling as announcers spoke of Allied breakthroughs. He began to see less defiance in the camp, more weary acceptance. Yet unpredictability lingered. A hardliner might still lash out, a desperate man might still run. And always there was the feeling, strange, unspoken, that the line between enemy and neighbor was thinner than it should be. For all its strangeness, the arrangement seemed stable. Cowboys rode, prisoners worked, the war thundered on oceans away. But history is rarely content to stay simple. One day in late spring, the train station buzzed with rumors. A new transport was arriving, not the usual sunburned soldiers, but something else entirely. Local boys perched on fence posts again, hats pushed back in disbelief. Jack heard the news from a railroad man, his voice low with surprise. "Not just men this time," the man said, eyes wide. "Women. German women." Jack frowned, unsure he'd heard right. Women prisoners of war? In this place of cattle drives and dust storms? The idea sounded almost absurd. Yet even as he dismissed it, the train whistle echoed across the prairie, long and low, carrying with it the promise of change. Behind the barbed wire, men lifted their heads at the sound, curiosity sparking like flint. Beyond the fences, townsfolk whispered, wondering what this would mean. For the camp, for the guards, for the fragile, uneasy balance of this unlikely meeting between cowboys and conquered soldiers. And so the quiet frontier, which had already bent to the weight of a global war, braced for something no one had planned. The arrival of women into a world of dust, cattle, and reluctant guardianship. It would test loyalties, stir emotions long buried, and blur the line between enemy and human in ways no barbed wire could contain. The train came at dawn, its whistle long and mournful as it broke the prairie silence. Jack Hollis leaned against the fence, dust on his boots, and watched the cars hiss to a stop. Guards moved into position, rifles slung but loose. From the iron doors stepped not the usual weary soldiers but a line of women, German women, blinking against the fierce Texas light. Some wore faded Luftwaffe auxiliary uniforms. Others had been stripped to plain work clothes. They carried small satchels, their hair tied back, faces pale after weeks at sea. Even the seasoned cowboys fell quiet. War had brought many strange things to the West, but this felt new, almost unreal. Among them was Liesel Vetter, 24, once a nurse in Hamburg before being swept into the Luftwaffe's medical corps. Her hands were rough from field work, but she still moved with the quiet poise of someone who had once cared for the wounded. Another, Greta Lang, was older, sharp-eyed, and wore her pride like armor. She had been a clerk at an airfield in France, captured when Allied troops overran the post. Rumor among the guards was that she'd been fiercely loyal to the Reich. They were few, barely a dozen women among hundreds of men, but their arrival rippled through the camp like a sudden gust of wind. The army fenced off a small corner of the compound for them, hastily adding privacy screens and crude wash areas. Still, it was no refuge, just another patch of dust hemmed in by wire. The men stared openly from their own barracks as the women were marched past, curiosity tempered by strict rules. Jack watched, half fascinated, half protective, sensing trouble in the charged silence that followed their arrival. The women's days quickly filled with tasks the army assigned, mending uniforms, sorting supplies, clerical work for officers. But at night, when the desert cooled and coyotes howled beyond the floodlights, their corner of the camp came alive with quiet resilience. Liesel stitched scraps of cloth into small comforts, a pillow, a scarf. Greta organized whispered gatherings, determined to maintain dignity. They sang low, haunting songs of home, river valleys, lost lovers, cities reduced to memory. The sound carried over the yard, soft and strange, until guards found themselves listening despite orders to stay distant. Inside the women's barracks, unspoken conflict simmered. Greta clung to her Nazi faith, urging the others to remain loyal, warning that fraternization meant betrayal. Liesel felt the pull of those words, but also the weight of exhaustion. She had seen too much suffering to believe in old propaganda. Here, in this unexpected land, kindness flickered from unlikely places. Guards offered extra coffee, farmers nodded without malice. One night, when a sandstorm tore through the camp, Jack and another cowboy rushed to secure loose boards. He caught Liesel's gaze through the swirl of grit, a moment quick and unplanned but human. Outside the fence, the town buzzed. People whispered about the German women, curious and uneasy. A few girls near the camp fence exchanged candy for small embroidered flowers. A rancher's wife hired 2 prisoners to mend clothes under guard. Regulations were strict. No touching, no passing notes, no unsupervised talk. But war rules rarely survive the slow grind of routine and the tug of humanity. Jack found himself escorting work details where Liesel was present. She spoke little English, but their exchanged glances, sometimes cautious, sometimes almost amused, grew into halting conversation. She asked once quietly if Texas always smelled of dust and cattle. He laughed, and for a heartbeat the war felt distant. Not everyone welcomed such moments. Reports reached army officers. Fraternization was eroding discipline. Greta, seeing Liesel softening, grew colder, whispering of shame and betrayal. Tension deepened when Allied radios announced Germany's collapsing front. Some of the men wept, others raged. Greta rallied a few to stand proud despite defeat. But many, including Liesel, felt only relief mixed with dread, relief at survival, dread of returning to a country in ruins. In early May, news arrived like thunder. Hitler was dead. Victory in Europe was days away. The camp erupted, not in celebration, but in a confused, heavy silence. Some men cheered quietly, daring to hope. Others retreated to bunks, faces buried in hands. For the women, the news struck deeper. Greta tried to stand taller, insisting Germany would rise again, but the cracks showed. Liesel sat apart that night, staring at the desert stars, trying to imagine a home she no longer knew. Jack, posted on night watch, saw her silhouette at the fence line, still as stone. Weeks later, word came. Repatriation would begin soon. Prisoners would be shipped back across the ocean, back to a land shattered by bombs and hunger. Some clung to the idea of return. Others feared it. The Americans, though professional, felt the quiet sorrow of parting. Jack had not dared more than brief words with Liesel, but something unspoken had grown, a fragile recognition of shared youth wasted by war. Now it would end without ceremony. On their last work assignment, Liesel and a few women helped pack medical supplies for transport. Jack stood nearby, rifle slung, watching her hands fold bandages with the same care she'd once given soldiers on battlefields. When their eyes met, there was no smile, only understanding. This strange crossing of lives was almost over. Greta passed by, spine rigid, ignoring him, her loyalty a final armor against a world she could not control. The day of departure came hot and bright. Trucks lined up, engines idling, dust swirling in wide arcs. Guards checked lists, names called out in clipped English. Some prisoners looked back at the camp with unexpected affection. Others kept their gaze fixed forward. When Liesel climbed into the truck bed, she glanced once toward the fence where Jack stood. It was a brief, searching look, not invitation, not farewell, but something harder to name, a moment heavy with what war steals before it can even be lived. Then she was gone, swallowed by the convoy. The trucks rolled out, their rumble fading across the plains until only the wind remained. Jack stayed by the wire long after, hat in his hands, caught between relief and a hollow ache he couldn't explain. Around him, the camp seemed suddenly smaller, just wood and wire under a vast sky. Yet something had shifted. The enemy had come close enough to touch, not with hands, but with shared humanity, and nothing about war felt as simple as it once had. Far out on the road, dust plumes marked the prisoners' passage back toward a broken Europe. Behind them they left quiet souvenirs, scraps of embroidery, fragments of song, glances that defied orders. In the silence that followed, the American West felt changed, no longer untouched by the world's turmoil. War had brought cowboys and conquerors face to face. Now it was sending them apart. But the memory of that collision, of wire that failed to keep hearts from reaching, would linger long after the trucks disappeared into heat and horizon.